Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So today we've got something a little bit different. Again, we're doing the video lectures, but we're going to jump outside the West for a change, do another one of these sort of little check-ins outside of the Western world, and talk about two of the biggest empires to ever exist in the world. Honestly, and they're not as well known, and I think that is in part because they're not as relevant to sort of the Western quote way of thinking or the way modern Europeans think of themselves. But as we'll see, they're pretty involved in a lot of different things, and they have their own distinct art styles and sets of ideas. So today we're going to be talking about the Ottomans and the Mongols. Yeah, where to start? I guess we can start with just a little look at the map here. So when we're looking at this part of the world, this is what people generally think of as, quote, the Middle East. And in fact, during the sort of Renaissance slash late medieval slash early modern period, the empires here were a variety of different Muslim empires, so culturally Muslim, usually run by a leader who was a political leader as well as a religious leader. So no separation of church and state. You have the caliph is sort of the classic example. We talked about Harun al-Rashid back in the Middle Ages and his Abbasid caliphate. The caliph is sort of the traditional name for the leader, but in this time period, we also have the sultan. And, there's no separation of church and state, but to be fair, I kind of think part of the reason for there being a separation of church and state idea in the West is because you had basically two competing centers of power on that front. You had the kings on the one hand, and you had the popes on the other. So if the popes weren't, as strong as they were in the way that they were, we might have had a much more, of a priest-king situation. In Islam or in Muslim countries, there has been much more often a sort of religious and a political leader. But that said, a lot of times he can be thought of as equivalent to a king, not taking as direct an influence on the religious movements of his empire. So it's interesting. And there's a few different empires during this time period. I alluded to the caliphates from a while ago. Now, as we move into more of the Renaissance period, we have the Ottomans, the Safavids, and I talked about these guys previously, the Mughals. So the Mughals were the Muslim group that ruled most of India, eventually expanding out even further from here. The Ottomans I'm going to talk about in a second. And you can see that they are their home base is kind of what we would call Turkey today, also known as the peninsula of Anatolia, or Asia Minor is another name for it, and then conquering over here. And then the Safavids have this region right here. And if we compare it to what is there currently today, this is today the country of Iran, but in antiquity, in ancient times, and up until relatively recently, it was known as Persia. And the Safavids can be thought of as a sort of family within this Persian culture. Kind of blocked off by mountains here and mountains here, and influential in some ways in the Mughal India and in the Ottoman Empire. But these three groups kind of stand apart. They're blocked by natural barriers. And another thing about the Safavids is that their culture is a little bit different. While the rest of these cultures are Sunni Muslim, the Safavids are Shia Muslim, which in practice, the main difference is a debate over who the original caliph should have been. The fourth caliph in line, he started off with Muhammad, and then there was a crisis of the successors, debate over whether Muhammad's nephew or one of his sort of lieutenants should have been the fourth caliph. And the Shia group, which has some presence in Iraq as well as in Iran or Persia. The Shia group believes that the succession should have gone to his nephew Ali. Now, in practice, what difference does this make for the cultures? Largely, it's just because they are isolated from each other. Their views about what religious law should be are different, and their views about various topics may go down a completely different path because they are not able to agree on sort of how the organization should have worked. And so those cultures tend to grow apart. So Persia has its own sort of distinct culture, and the Safavids represent that. But the main thing we want to talk about today are the Ottomans. So the Ottomans are descended from a guy named Osman, and he was a Turk, or maybe a proto-Turk, what we'd call part of Turkish culture, which is where we get Turkey from. So cultures that lived up of here, Osman was a guy who was very good at conquering. He expanded out his empire, and it became an empire that stretched over this whole region. Now, the big reason, and I think we alluded to this before, the big reason that that the Ottomans were notable to Europeans is because they took over Constantinople. So up until this point, up until the 1400s, which is about when we are now in our kind of historical survey here, up until the 1400s, you had Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire. It had a good 1,000-year run. And over there, it was a different culture. It was somewhat alien to the Western Christians, but it was still a Christian culture dominating the region. And Istanbul was seen in some ways as a very holy city with a lot of holy churches, very involved, of course, with Constantine, who named the city after him, and he's the big guy who legalized Christianity, so it's a big deal. And it's sort of like the nearest stop to the Holy Land for Christians. Who go off and fight over in crusades. At one point, the Venetians took it over, but it got its independence again. But a couple hundred years after that, in come the Ottomans to take it over. So this was a big deal. This happened under the Ottoman Sultan, and in the Ottoman Empire, sultans, Mehmed II. And Mehmed managed to take down these walls that had very rarely been breached. This ultra-secure city that was blocked off by ocean and huge walls. He was able to conquer it. And so he set about sort of reestablishing things. For instance, the great mosque of Hagia Sophia was the great church of Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. And he also established new mosques in the area. But like a lot of Muslim rulers, he didn't try to forcibly make everybody convert to Islam. That's not something that we would see happening in that time period. Instead, what people tend to do is make taxes for the Christians and Jews in their empire, which is pretty smart. It's sort of a like an incentive, like a political economic incentive. You don't want to pay the money? Okay, become a Muslim. And it's a pretty savvy strategy that sort of allows you to respect people while also spreading your religion. It's an interesting, middle ground between the two anyway. So now, even though there were these positive aspects to the way Mehmed and the Muslims rulers tended to rule, you can imagine what the reaction would have been in Western Europe to the news that Constantinople had fallen to the Muslims, to the folks that they had been, fighting for control of the Holy Land with. So that was a big deal. It was an existential shock. It was like, we don't even know what the world is anymore if heathens control Constantinople. So Christians did try to fight and reconquer Constantinople, but it was ultimately not to be. And from this point on, look at the map here. And actually, I have an even better one here. So we have the whole region of basically Egypt and moving over to Algeria and Morocco, almost to Morocco. But Northern Africa, firmly under control of the Ottomans. And Greece is now under the control of the Ottomans. And that's pretty interesting because Greece has had its own distinct culture. At this point, very religious, very Christian. Mehmed could not have converted all the Christians in Greece if he tried. But also its own sort of classical legacy. And Mehmed generally respected all that. But from this point on, Greek culture was going to be influenced by Muslim culture, by Turkish culture, Ottoman culture. And when we come up to the modern day, there's this sense of sort of much later on, Greeks decided to define themselves in opposition to the Turks, even though for a good period of like 400 years, they were part of that empire. And so there's this almost like backlash to it that you see in the way that sort of Turks and Greeks get along with each other. Of course, there was this whole movement in around the time of the independence of Turkey, that all the Muslims should live in Turkey and all the Christians should live in Greece, and it led to some pretty nasty persecution. So, but yeah, that just always comes to mind when I think about Turkey and Greece. But they have a lot of same things in common. They have a lot of cooking styles in common. They have a lot of they have the same coffee. You know, you can call it Turkic coffee or you can call it Greek coffee. Just know who you're talking to when you say that. So yeah, there's a lot to think about here in terms of the cultural legacy of Greece and the Ottomans. But like I say, the Ottomans lasted for a really long time, up until World War One. Now they fell into a bit of a decline. Um, they fell into a bit of a decline, well, pretty significant decline, honestly. They had most of the same territory, but they weren't very strong, and they needed to make alliances with other empires. But at one point, they were one of the biggest empires in the world. But in the 1900s, they were going to kind of drop off a fair bit. They were called the sick man of Europe. And then when World War One happened, they basically imploded, and Europeans carved it up to make lots of different countries. And they may or may not have done that great a job of it, but we'll get back to that in a second. One of the most important leaders of the Caliphate was the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. He was a very sort of capable leader and commander, and he became known as one of the ones that Europeans were most often going up against. But there was a certain respect for him too, that he was kind of impressive. He was the kind of foreign heathen that Europeans could respect on some level, even though he was their opponent. So he appears as almost a sort of romantic figure. And he appears that way in the Muslim world too, as this sort of noble and impressive leader. You'll notice also that he is being depicted visually. In some Islamic art, you're not allowed to depict anything visually, any like human or animal figures. In other Islamic art, it just depends on the region and where you go. You are allowed to depict them in a secular context, so you just can't depict religious figures. And then in a few places, you can even depict religious figures if you're not, trying to make it into a statue that you worship or something like that. But yeah, that's a little look at the Ottomans there. But one of the more distinct aspects or attributes of Ottoman culture is devshirme, which is known as the blood, which could be translated as the blood tax or the child tax. So that doesn't sound great, right? And it wasn't really. Even though we said that Ottomans and got along, they didn't try to forcibly convert everybody in their empire, there were still some ways in which they exercised their power over the people they had conquered. In their empire, they would take Christian children and, they'd request a certain quota of them, a certain amount that just had to be handed over. They would take them by force. And they would train these children, and these children they would convert to be Muslims, and they would train them as these warriors. So they became this elite warrior group that was kind of the backbone of keeping the empire together in a lot of ways. And these were known as the Janissaries. And the Janissaries, yeah, they got to be quite significant and powerful, even though as children they had been taken from their families and sort of, basically indoctrinated into this military cult. As they grew up, they could take on more and more power. And eventually one of the crisis points for the Ottoman Sultanate would be a rebellion of the Janissaries, not necessarily on the grounds that they had been stolen and abused, although they had, but on the grounds that they were losing their power, and they wanted to hold on to power. And that sort of, eventually they became able to kind of threaten the Sultan. And so, that's a success story in a certain way, quite a turnaround. Yeah, but that is one thing that is pretty wild and interesting about the Ottoman world. Now, when we talk about Islamic art, we see some very distinct art styles. Notice the use of color and shape and pattern. In the Ottoman Empire, these patterns were a big form of the art. Also notice the use of calligraphy, the beautiful writing in Arabic. Arabic has always been very important in Muslim culture as the language in which it is considered best to read the Quran, the holy book. So Arabic is very important. And if we think about the idea that is common at many times and places in the Muslim world and in the Ottoman Empire included, that one should not make visual depictions of things, of animals or human beings. And this is an idea that goes back to the Jews with the idea of not making idols. Then what kind of art style is going to develop out of that? Well, we would see an art style that focuses very much on patterns, very much on shapes. Some plants, as we see here, we've got kind of a tree of life thing going on, but not animals or humans in this particular style of art. Now, it could vary a lot in different places, but that's the style of art. The other thing is to make your writing very beautiful. And writing is very important, Arabic writing especially. And so that is a way you can create beauty in the world around you. So I actually have a video here. So I'm going to switch over to that. And let me remember to put the sound on. And we will go ahead and watch, not the whole thing here, but some of this. So we'll start from... No, actually, let's start from the beginning. Just a second here. It's also probably going to be, it's going to be a bit weird and stuttery.
By refusing to depict nature,
it's going to be a bit weird and stuttery.
Representationally,
so if
Islamic art opens the door to an enchanted world.
Where to find it. All right. Here we go. Hopefully this is reasonable.
Do not try to depict the Lord or his creatures. Paint only trees, flowers, inanimate objects. For on the day of judgment, those who have been painted will come to reclaim their souls from the artist, who, unable to satisfy them, will experience the torment of eternal damnation. These words, attributed to Muhammad, were instrumental in the development of Islamic art. It was an entirely original approach to art, which is radically different in its forms and principles to the European system of fine art. Drawing its inspiration chiefly from the Quran, Islamic art is essentially religious in character. It praises God and his creation without attempting to define or depict him. Even the architecture of this mosque is the expression of the holy word of the Quran. The beauty of the calligraphy and the arabesques are a way of praising God. The Western idea of the artist does not exist in Islam. There is no division between the artist, the artisan, and the restorer. This man retouching a carnation at the entrance to the Lahore Mosque is the heir to a long tradition of painters. He repeats the gestures that he has learnt. The word art means nothing to him. For him, this act, this carnation, is a way of being aware of the world and of nature, just like the image of the caliph inhaling the perfume of the flower in Ottoman miniatures.
Oops.
By refusing to depict nature representationally, Islamic art opens the door to an enchanted world where the imagination is free to make its own laws. The arabesque is one of the most important of Islamic art forms. It is based on simple geometric figures, but it turns abstract art into something tangible and living. Islamic art combines the precision of mathematics and the freedom of the imagination. At first glance, it is the latter which seems to dominate. But in fact, the arabesque begins with the artist establishing precise geometric patterns. He draws perfectly regular rosettes, triangles, and pentagons, and uses these structures as the basis for an art which looks entirely fresh and spontaneous. The arabesque unites an almost crystalline purity with an infinite freedom of form.
Let's see, maybe just a little bit longer here.
Calligraphy goes far beyond the Western notion of mere handwriting. It is still taught today. It allows the established shapes in handwriting a freedom of form, restrained only by the space to be filled.
بنكتبها بسمك القلم أو سمك الأداة اللي احنا بنكتب بيها.
Everything begins from a dot on the right, and this is regularly drawn as the diameter of a circle, which is then transformed into curves, arcs, ovals, and ellipses. The elaborations of calligraphy are a way of giving expression to the meaning of the word, rather in the way that medieval monks decorated the letters of manuscripts.
بداية الكتابة هنلاقي إن الألف بتيجي هنا بزاوية 45 وبتنتهي أيضا بزاوية 45.
Geometric forms of triangles, squares, and circles are used, as they are in the arabesque, to give freedom and fluidity to the word. Calligraphy is the epitome of a religious art form because it draws its origins from the scribes who worked on the texts of the Quran. The beauty of the passages should be reflected in the visual graphic beauty with which they are transcribed. In this way, calligraphy serves a wholly religious purpose by enhancing the understanding of the Holy Word.
Okay, that's a good stopping point, I think. So hopefully that gives you some sense of the different kinds of things that you can do with calligraphy and with that system of sort of using geometric patterns, which is known as arabesques. That's kind of a Western word, you know, it's an art style of the Arabs, but I think it's a useful one to talk about this particular sort of style of heavily geometric art. Okay, so I'm going to end this video here, and then in the next one, we will talk about a little bit more stuff in the Muslim world, and then move on to China.